He swaggered through life, his badge a shield he thought no one could pierce, until he dragged the wrong woman into a courtroom. A soldier whose strength would unravel his world. The rain came down in a lazy drizzle, just enough to slicken the asphalt of Interstate 20 outside Atlanta, Georgia. The highway stretched out like a black ribbon under the night sky, empty except for the occasional rumble of a semi-truck rolling past, its headlights slicing through the haze. Sodium streetlights flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows that danced across the wet pavement. It was too late for most folks to be out here, the kind of hour where the world felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. Major Latoya Jackson gripped the wheel of her beat-up Ford Escape, her fingers tapping a soft rhythm against the leather. The old SUV hummed along, its tires whispering against the road. She wasn't in uniform tonight, just a faded gray hoodie and jeans. Her hair pulled back into a tight ponytail that swung lightly with every turn of her head. The radio crackled faintly, B.B. King's gravelly voice spilling through the speakers. With a slow blues riff, Latoya hummed along, her voice low and steady, a habit she'd picked up during long nights in the barracks at Fort Benning. She'd just wrapped up a training rotation there, 3 weeks of drills and briefings, and all she wanted now was a hot shower and her own bed. Then she saw it, a flash of red and blue in her rearview mirror. Her stomach tightened, not out of fear but exhaustion. Again? She muttered under her breath, her eyes narrowing. Lord, not tonight. She flicked on her blinker, easing the car onto the shoulder with the precision of someone who'd run this drill too many times. The gravel crunched under her tires as she shifted into park, her hands resting deliberately on the wheel 10 and 2, just like they taught her. She wasn't about to give anyone an excuse. The patrol car pulled up behind her, its lights pulsing like a heartbeat against the darkness. The door swung open, and out stepped Officer Troy Miller, his heavy boots scuffing the asphalt with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He was a big guy, broad shoulders, buzz cut, the kind of cop who carried himself like he owned every inch of the road. He didn't rush, letting the silence stretch as he approached a window, one hand resting on his belt, the other clutching a flashlight that snapped on with a sharp click. The beam cut through the drizzle, landing square on her face. He tapped the glass with his knuckles, a hard, impatient rap. Latoya rolled the window down, the cool night air slipping in with the faint scent of wet earth. Miller didn't bother with a greeting, just leaned in slightly, his voice flat and clipped. License and registration. Now. She tilted her head just enough to meet his gaze, her brown eyes steady, unflinching. Was I speeding, officer? Her tone was calm, almost too calm, with a faint edge of something that wasn't quite a challenge, but wasn't submission either. Miller's jaw twitched, his lips curling into the barest hint of a smirk. Just hand over the papers, ma'am. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Latoya exhaled through her nose, a slow, measured breath. She'd been here before too many times to count. The headlights of a passing truck swept over them, briefly illuminating the name on his badge, Miller. She filed it away, a soldier's instinct kicking in. Whatever this was, it wasn't about a traffic stop. Not really. And she'd be damned if she let him think she was just another easy target. The drizzle had thickened into a steady patter, drumming against the roof of Latoya's Ford Escape as she sat parked on the shoulder of I-20. The red and blue lights from Miller's patrol car pulsed relentlessly, staining the wet asphalt like spilled paint. Latoya kept her hands on the wheel, her breathing slow and deliberate, the kind of control she'd honed through years of military training through sandstorms in Iraq, firefights in Afghanistan. Nights were the only thing keeping her alive was staying sharp. This wasn't combat, but damn if it didn't feel like a battlefield. Officer Troy Miller stood just outside her window, his flashlight beam still trained on her face, cutting through the dim interior of the SUV. he flipped through her license and registration with a lazy flick of his wrist, holding them just out of her reach like a taunt. His eyes darted from the papers to her car, then back to her, sizing her up. "Tail lights out," he said finally, his voice flat, like he'd rehearsed it 100 times. Latoya frowned, her brows knitting together. "That can't be right," she said, keeping her tone even. "I had the car checked last week. Everything was fine." Miller's head snapped up, his smirk widening into something uglier. "You arguing with me?" His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a man used to being obeyed. He shifted his weight, the creak of his leather belt loud against the rain. Latoya met his gaze in the side mirror, her reflection steady against the flicker of his flashlight. She could feel it, the shift, that quiet moment where power flexed and waited for resistance to crumble. She'd seen it before, in briefings about civilian interactions, in the stories her mother used to tell about the old days down south. She knew better than to push too hard, but she also knew her rights. "I'm just saying," she replied, her voice calm as still water. "My taillights were working. If there's an issue now, I'll get it fixed." Miller's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. "Step out of the car," he snapped, cutting her off like she hadn't spoken. His hand dropped to his belt, fingers brushing the cuffs dangling there. Latoya exhaled slowly, her breath fogging briefly in the cool air. She glanced at the empty highway ahead. No headlights, no witnesses. Just her and this man with a badge and a chip on his shoulder. "Mind telling me why?" she asked, her tone still measured, though a steel edge crept in. Miller tilted his head, his smirk creeping back. "Because I said so." The words landed like a slap, and for a split second, Latoya's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. She let the silence stretch, unbuckling her seatbelt with a slow, deliberate click. She wasn't looking for a fight, not tonight, but she'd be damned if she let him bully her into submission. Pushing the door open, she stepped onto the pavement, the rain dampening her hoodie as she straightened up. At 5'8", she wasn't small, and years in the army had given her a presence that didn't shrink. She kept her posture relaxed, but firm, her hands loose at her sides. Miller took a step back, his eyes narrowing as he scanned her from head to toe. She could feel him weighing her, deciding how far he could push. "Turn around," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Hands on the car?" Latoya didn't move. "For what reason?" she asked, her words crisp, cutting through the rain. Miller stepped closer, his boots splashing in a shallow puddle. "You resisting?" His smirk was gone now, replaced by a hard glint in his eyes, annoyance, maybe anger. He reached for his radio with one hand, the other hovering near his cuffs. "Got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into the speaker, loud enough for her to hear, then barked. "Turn around." Her pulse kicked up, but her face stayed a mask of calm. "Officer," she said, her voice low and firm, "I need you to understand something. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do and what you can't." Miller's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening around the radio. "You're under arrest," he snapped, lunging for her wrist. Latoya moved before he could grab her, stepping back just enough to keep out of reach. "Under arrest for what?" She shot back, her voice rising for the first time sharp with disbelief. "For obstructing an officer." He yanked the cuffs free, the metal glinting under the streetlights. As he closed the distance again, she exhaled sharply through her nose, a bitter laugh caught in her throat. So that was his play twist, her words, her questions, into some flimsy excuse to lock her up. Her military training surged to the surface, heartbeat steady, breathing even. She had two choices: comply and fight this later, or push back and risk it all going sideways. She wasn't about to become another name on a list, another story whispered in barbershops and church pews. "Fine," she said, her voice dropping to a steely calm. She turned slowly, placing her hands on the cool, wet roof of her car. "But you're making a mistake." Miller didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arms, yanking them behind her back. With more force than necessary, the cuffs snapping shut tight enough to bite into her skin. "Lady," he chuckled, shoving her toward the patrol car. "I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't, not even close. The hard plastic seat of the patrol car dug into her back as Miller slammed the door shut, sealing her inside. Her wrists burned where the cuffs pressed too deep, but she sat still, her breath measured, her eyes locked on the partition ahead. Outside, Miller strutted back to his vehicle, muttering into his radio with that same smug swagger. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass, calm, composed, but beneath it, a fire simmered. She'd been through hell overseas, faced down enemies with guns and grit, but this was a different kind of war, a man with a badge. Drunk on power, convinced he could break her. He was wrong. The patrol car lurched forward as Miller slid into the driver's seat, whistling a tuneless melody. "Most folks just shut up when I tell them to step out," he said after a moment, his voice dripping with mockery. Latoya didn't flinch. "And most officers don't arrest people for asking a question," she replied, her words slicing through the air like a blade. Miller laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." She looked at him through the glass, her gaze unwavering. "I don't think," she said softly. "I know." The patrol car rolled to a stop outside a squat, gray brick police station just off the highway, its flickering neon sign buzzing faintly in the damp night air. The rain had eased, leaving a slick sheen on the parking lot that reflected the red and blue lights still flashing overhead. Latoya sat in the back, her wrists aching from the cuffs Miller had fastened too tight deliberately. She knew. The hard plastic seat pressed into her spine, but she kept her posture straight, her breathing steady. She'd endured worse desert heat, mortar fire, nights with no sleep. This was nothing. Or it should have been. Miller swung the driver's door open, his boots hitting the pavement with a wet thud. He didn't look at her as he circled around, just yanked her door open and barked, "Let's go." His voice had lost some of its swagger, replaced by a clipped irritation she could feel radiating off him. Latoya twisted her wrists slightly as she stepped out, the metal biting deeper into her skin. She didn't wince, didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she lifted her chin, her eyes locking onto his for a brief second. He looked away, first dot inside. The station smelled like stale coffee and sweat, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps. A bored desk sergeant glanced up from his paperwork, barely registering her as Miller marched her past, his grip on her arm tighter than it needed to be. He led her through booking, fingerprints, mugshot, the whole routine, his silence broken only by the occasional grunt of command. The other officers didn't look up, just shuffled through their own monotony. Latoya had seen this kind of indifference before, the kind that let men like Miller thrive unchecked. When it was done, he shoved her toward a holding cell in the back, a narrow box of concrete and steel bars. The metal clanged shut behind her. As he finally uncuffed her, the sudden release sending a sharp sting through her wrists. She rubbed them slowly, watching him through the bars. He stood there, arms crossed, that smug smirk creeping back onto his face like a mask he couldn't live without. "Comfy?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Latoya didn't answer, just leaned back against the cold wall, her eyes fixed on him. The cell was bare four walls, a flickering bulb, a metal bench bolted to the floor. She'd spent nights in worse places, foxholes, and forward bases where the threat wasn't just discomfort but death. This was a petty power play, and she wasn't about to let it shake her. Miller tilted his head, stepping closer to the bars. "You know, if you just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now." She let a slow smile curl at the edges of her lips, the first crack in her stoic mask. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." His smirk faltered. Just for a heartbeat, a flicker of something in his eyes. Uncertainty, maybe, before he covered it with a scoff. "No one's coming for you tonight, lady," he said, glancing around the empty holding area. "Guess you'll have plenty of time to think about that attitude." She didn't flinch, didn't blink. "And you'll have plenty of time to think about what you just stepped in," she replied, her voice low, steady, cutting through the stale air like a blade. Miller's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his arms. "See, here's the thing," he said, leaning in until his face was inches from the bars, his voice dropping to a growl. "People like you think the rules don't apply. You think a little sass is going to get you out of trouble." Latoya held, his gaze unflinching. "People like me?" she echoed, her tone deceptively soft. "I fought for this country, bled for it, so you could stand there with that badge. And you use it to drag folks like me down. That's the real trouble." Here, he opened his mouth, but before he could snap back, heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. A younger officer, maybe late 20s, appeared, his standard-issue uniform crisp, but his face uneasy. He held a clipboard, shifting on his feet as he stopped a few paces back. Sergeant," he said, his voice tinged with hesitation. "We got a call." Miller barely glanced at him. "Handle it," he grunted, his eyes still locked on Latoya. The kid swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "It's from the Army. They're asking about her." He nodded toward Latoya, his voice dropping lower. "And I think you need to hear this." Miller froze, his head snapping toward the younger officer. "What?" he barked, but there was a crack in his tone now, a hint of something unsteady. Latoya leaned forward slightly, her smile widening just enough to show teeth. "Told you," she said, her words quiet but heavy. "They don't like to wait." Miller's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. He shot her one last glare, a mix of fury and something that looked dangerously close to fear, before turning on his heel and storming off with the younger officer trailing behind. Latoya settled onto the bench, the cold metal pressing through her jeans. She could hear their voices fading down the hall, Miller's sharp, annoyed mutters, the kids' stammered replies. Whatever they'd said on that call, it wasn't good. For him, she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence settle. This wasn't over, not yet, but the tide was turning. And when it did, Miller wouldn't know what hit him. Morning light spilled through the narrow windows of the Fulton County Courthouse, cutting sharp streaks across the polished wooden floors. The air inside was crisp, heavy with the scent of old paper and wax polish. Major Latoya Jackson stood near the defendant's table, her posture relaxed but her presence commanding. She'd traded the hoodie for a tailored navy blazer over a simple white blouse. No uniform, no fanfare, just quiet strength. Beside her, Denise Harper, her attorney, flipped through a stack of papers with the efficiency of a woman who lived for moments like this. Latoya liked that no nonsense, just results. The heavy doors at the back swung open, and Officer Troy Miller walked in. His shoulders were still squared, his chin tilted up like he owned the room, but there was a stiffness in his stride now, a flicker of unease in his eyes. He caught Latoya's gaze for a split second and looked away, his jaw tightening. "Good. Judge." Clarence Hayes entered, an older man with a weary face and silver hair, settling behind the bench with a sigh. He adjusted his glasses and waved a hand. "Let's get to it," he said, his voice gravelly but firm. Denise stepped forward, her tone clipped and precise. "Your Honor, we submit that Major Latoya Jackson was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Evidence from Officer Miller's body cam shows no violation, only a fabricated claim about a tail light. Furthermore, his arrest history reveals a pattern of targeting black drivers in this district. A murmur rippled through the sparse courtroom reporters, a few officers, locals who'd caught wind of the case. Miller shifted in his seat, his hands clenching into fists. Judge Hayes peered over his glasses at him. "Sergeant Miller, care to explain?" Miller leaned forward, clearing his throat. "She was uncooperative, Your Honor. Routine stop gone south because she wouldn't follow orders." Denise didn't miss a beat. "Uncooperative?" She held up a transcript, her voice rising with controlled indignation. "Major Jackson's record speaks for itself. Distinguished service. No priors, no citations. Are you saying a decorated Army officer posed such a threat over a traffic stop that you had to cuff her?" Miller opened his mouth, then shut it, his face reddening. The silence stretched, thick and damning. Judge Hayes tapped his file with a sigh. "Let's see the footage." The bailiff lowered a screen, and the body cam video played Miller's barked commands, Latoya's calm questions, the unnecessary escalation, the cuffs snapping shut with a smug flourish. The room went quiet, the weight of it sinking in. Hayes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Sergeant, you violated protocol, conducted an unlawful arrest, and omitted key details from your report. Charges against Major Jackson are dismissed." His gavel cracked down, sharp and final. "And I'm ordering an internal review of your conduct." Miller slumped back, his face flushed, fists trembling. Latoya exhaled slowly, her expression unchanged. She'd never doubted this outcome. As she gathered her things, she glanced at Miller one last time. Their eyes met no words, just a silent reckoning. He stormed out, his boots echoing down the hall, the sound of a man who'd lost more than a case. Latoya's fight wasn't just hers. It was a stand for every black man and woman who'd faced a badge wielded like a weapon. Her victory in that courthouse wasn't luck. It was the product of resilience forged in combat, intelligence sharpened by years of service, and a refusal to bow to injustice. Miller thought he could break her, but he didn't know the strength of a woman who'd stared down war and walked away whole. The lesson here cuts deep. Power unchecked breeds abuse, and silence enables it. Latoya didn't just win for herself. She exposed a system that thrives on indifference, one that's failed too many for too long. Her story stings because it's real, because for every Latoya with a voice and a rank, there are countless others without a camera, a lawyer, or a chance. But it's also a spark. She stood tall so others could too, proving that courage isn't loud. It's steady, unyielding, a quiet fire that burns through the dark. This isn't the end of the fight. It's a call. Speak up, push back, hold the line, because change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from women like Latoya, born to stand when the world expects them to kneel.